Hello and welcome to my video lecture on three-tier architectures. So we've talked about this already, so some of these slides I'm going to go through fairly quickly. But a three-tier architecture is pretty much the client is going to be using a browser window, so they're just going to be presented with a GUI interface. The application server, in this case is typically a web server, enforces all the business rules, and we'll talk about the reason for that in just a moment. And then we've got our database server, which does all our data storage. So in this case, the idea is a thin client. We really can't load anything through a browser window onto the client computer. So if you think about it, when you open up a browser window, you want it to load up quickly. So it cannot be what's known as a heavy web page. So the client is almost always thin. It's typically just a shell. The user does some data entry, they click a button, the information from that page is sent across the network, the internet, back to the application server. At that point, the application server tries to enforce some business rules, and if any kind of errors are going to happen, the application server would just send the information back to the client in some kind of an error message, so that you're really keeping down, again, the network traffic internally, because your application server is usually on the outside of your, it's within your firewall, but we'll talk about that scenario in just a second. So then, just as a graphical representation, we've got our extra layer of our application server associated with our LAN. So we've got our thin clients. Our clients are communicating via LAN or the internet to the application server. In this case, it's a three-tier architecture, so we're really not bringing the web into this just yet. The application server handles all the business rules, and then if the business rules are all satisfied by the transactions, the actual updates, commands are sent back to the database server. So when we're talking about a thin client, it's really just the interface. Very, very little application processing, with no or very limited local storage on the client. Most commonly, the thin client is a web browser, right, in a three-tier architecture. So now we're going to get into the N-tier architecture. So we've got our public is on their internet client. We could have extranet clients, all going through the web, passing through our firewall, getting authenticated, all that kind of good stuff. And then internally, using TCP/IP, our internal clients with web browsers. As I said in previous videos, we do this here at Hofstra all the time. We've got web servers, we've got database servers, and then the database server talks to our database management system. What are some components of a web application? One, you're going to need your database server. It could be just about anything, right? MySQL is getting much more popular. You could have a web server that's going to serve, your web pages, typically Apache or IIS. Then we've got our application server, which could be, the .NET framework, some Java, Cold Fusion, PHP, some kind of software building blocks that create your dynamic websites and web pages. And then you've got your web browser, which is your client, right? So we've backed up. We've gone from our database server to our web server to our application server to our web browser on the client end. How's the processing happen? So we're either using HTML, something that I'm not crazy familiar with is standard generalized markup language. Then we've got XML, which we're going to talk about at the end of this chapter. We've got XHTML. We've got JavaScript. We've got cascading style sheets, which if you're going to get into web development, you're going to get very familiar with cascading style sheets. And then XSL and XSLT, again, we're going to talk about at the end of the chapter. So what happens? We've got this, in some cases, we've got a static page request, right? So the user has accessed an HTML or an HTML form or simply a page, or we have dynamic page requests, usually written in JSP, ASP, ASPX, PHP. In this case, we've got server-side processing, right? If it's just a static web page, a web server handles that. You want to see a page? Here's a page. You want to mess with data? Now you're going to need some server-side processing. Again, we could have JSP, ASP.NET applications, Cold Fusion, your PHP, and then in the back end you've got your database access. We've seen an example of JDBC and .NET, but there's a host of others that are out there. And then when you talk about the information flow, we've got a static page request. All that's happening is there's an interaction between our web server and our client. That's it. If you just want a web page, here's your web page. If we're talking dynamic, now we need information from our database server. So our client is going to send, a request via JSP to the web server. The web server is going to talk through some kind of JSP or servlet to the application server. Again, we're going to use some kind of Java going through a driver. In that case, at this point, we're probably at the API level. We're going to call the database as necessary if we need it. And then the database server through the driver, back through the application server, back through the web server is going to return some HTML result back to our client. A quick example, this is ASP.NET. It's in your textbook. I'm not going to go crazy with this. Just realize that something quick like this can result in something that looks like this. So this is a very quick data entry web page. Could be written in anything. In this case, it's ASP.NET with an insert and a cancel button. Bang, and that's it. So that is the end of my video lecture on 3-tier architectures and web processing.